All right, so it's processing. I'll also record the session, right, people? So you will also listen to a message, a chime.
It is live. Okay, everyone, good evening for those that have just arrived. We're very happy to have you all here with us today to talk a little bit more about literature. I'm Audio. I'm one of the teachers here in the Book a Month, and I'll be talking a little bit more today. Yeah, so let me share the slides with you, and we can start. Can you see my slides, everyone? Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so our class today is entitled Sherlock Holmes and Other Detectives in Literary History, right? So this is an open class. Anna and myself, we promote such classes in order for you to have a feel of how it is to be a part of a book a month. Many of our students, they come to the classes and it's great. It's a way for us to provide a little bit more content for them. But these classes are thought for those that are not part of a book a month. So you get a glimpse of how we operate in the school, right? And today we'll be doing something which is a little bit of literary history. The history of literature is very long. So, so I'm not sure how much ground we can cover there, but for sure we'll talk a lot about Holmes and its legacy and his influence. Okay. So before we start, Anna, the floor is yours.
Mhm. Hi, people. Welcome, everyone. I think I am the person that you see the most in appearing in a book a month, right? But this is going to change very soon. Audio is going to also be appearing much more in his videos. But Audio is a teacher at a book a month. He's a postdoc in literature. Just as myself, he's a teacher at a book a month for a long time, and also he is a postdoc researcher at the University of Padua. I am Ana Torquato, right? If you're seeing me for the first time live, then nice to see you and thank you for being here. But of course, you see me in our profile. I'm a teacher and founder of Book a Month, and I am also a teacher and researcher at the University of Vienna. And A Book a Month is a project that we take a lot of pride in and satisfaction, and are very happy to offer this class for you this evening. So, welcome all of you. So, if you're seeing us for the first time, if you're joining one of our classes for the first time, A Book a Month is a school that teaches literature in English, right? And we do this combination between English teaching and reading in English as a way to practice and improve language, both written, both for reading and also for speaking. And you do that while learning about literature, not only reading literature, but also learning about literature, which is something that we do with very thoroughly, right? And we have been doing this for quite some time. This is our fifth year working with literature and reading literature in English with you guys. And we hope that we have many more to come. Yes. I think that's it for me today. And I hope that you have a great session with Audio. And back to you.
Thank you, Anna. Anna will be here answering the chat. So if you have questions, you can write there because since I'll be doing the talking, I can't really keep an eye on the chat live. The class we'll be teaching today is similar to one of our courses, called Short Stories, in which our students read every week a different short story. And the idea of this course is that you get a glimpse of different tastes of literature. You know, it's like a banquet. You have like 10 different authors from different places around the world, and you read a little bit, like usually two short stories per person, right? And so these are the authors we'll be reading this semester. And you can see that it's pretty broad. Like Doris Lessing, for example, right here is a Nobel Prize winner from England, but she has lived for many years in Zimbabwe. Kipling, who is also a writer from England, but who actually was born in India. He was born in Bombay. You can see Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for example, a contemporary writer. He just died a few months ago. He's from Kenya and he writes in English. So it's the whole idea is to taste a little bit of literary classics, sometimes contemporary authors. You know, some people are very famous. Maybe many of you know Hong Kong, I guess, the South Korean writer who won the Nobel Prize just recently. Some are less known, but just as good, right? And some of the authors, like actually three of the authors that we'll be reading this semester, are in some way related to detective fiction. The first of them, right, Arthur Conan Doyle, is the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and so obviously there's a lot to be said there. But also Nathaniel Hawthorne and Ambrose Bierce, they're both writers from the USA, and they're also incorporating elements of detective fiction in their writings. So this is why we decided to go with Sherlock. To give an introduction to our students, something we'll not really be covering in the classes, because in our classes we debate the short stories, right, and the text. So we read first, and then we come to the class, we teach a little bit, and then there's a debate among the students, and so we don't have the opportunity to do literary history in the way we'll do it today. So it's slightly different. Okay. So in order to start, we have to define crime fiction, right? And there are many names for this. Sometimes we call it detective novels. Sometimes we call it mystery novels or mystery narratives, or there are many different names. In English, they use a lot this one, a crime fiction. And I like this term because it is very broad. Crime fiction actually is bigger than detective fiction, you know? So detective fiction is a subgenre of crime fiction, okay? And the, the main idea behind crime fiction, if you have to define it, it is not defined by its form. It is defined by the content. Okay, so this is sometimes when we're talking about literature, we talk about literary genres, right? Like tragedy or comedy or poetry or etc. But sometimes that may be a bit confusing because the word genre can mean two different things. Sometimes genre means the form, okay? So it is the cup. But sometimes genre means the content, which is water in this case. Maybe you're drinking juice or Coke or whatever. But there's a little bit of ambiguity sometimes when we use this term, the genre, right? In this case, crime fiction is defined by the content. So any story whose plot revolves around a mystery, not necessarily a crime, okay? Usually a crime, but it is a mystery. It could be broader than a crime, you know? Typically involving an investigation. So there is something that people have to explain it for some reason. And in order to explain that thing, that crime, that mystery, that secret, in order to unravel it, they have to investigate. They need clues. They use deduction, they use logic. And eventually, if we're talking about a crime, and usually we are, the pursuit of justice, right? So, a part of crime fiction, one of the subgenres is definitely detective stories. This is the genre that we are most used with. We think about Sherlock Holmes, we think about Agatha Christie, and so on. But there are also others, for example, police procedurals. Okay, Those are, those kind of movies when you already know who committed the crime, but this person is a powerful billionaire or an influential politician, and then there's no way to put that person in jail. Everybody knows that that person is guilty, but it seems that the other person is, like is escaping through the police's fingers. So that kind of stories is a kind of crime fiction, but it's not necessarily a detective narrative. Okay, it's more about how we're gonna put them in jail. It's more about the process, and usually sometimes you don't even have detectives there. What you have are mostly lawyers, actually, right? So there is quite a lot of there are quite a lot of possibilities within the genre. The genre is filled of conventions and tropes. Okay, trope in English means lugar comum. Okay, so basically. There are certain patterns, certain things that we have to accept when we're reading crime fiction. There are some expectations, when we start reading. If by the end of you read the entire novel by Agatha Christie, if you get to the end and she doesn't reveal who the murderer is, you feel you feel cheated. You feel like, what the hell? I've read, 400 pages and I don't even get, the answer for the crime. It would be very frustrating. And it would be frustrating because she's breaking a convention of the genre, right? It is a convention that by the end of the story, you're going to know who did it, right? So is that clear, the definition? So one interesting thing about crime fiction is that since it is determined by the content, okay, what I mean by that is that I can write a poem that is, if this poem is about the solution of a crime, even if it's in meter, even if I'm using rhymes, it is still crime fiction. Okay, so the form might change, but what is important here is the content, and um, in this uh, in this way, crime fiction is rather similar to other popular genres like science fiction. Okay, like fantasy. Fantasy is also defined by what people do. If you have magic, if you have dragons and things like that, whoa, probably is fantasy. Wizards, you know. If by the same token, if you have crazy monsters that are brought up in a laboratory, it is probably science fiction, because of the content. And horror, it's working the same way. You can have a horror poem. You can have I don't know, horror theater if you want. So you can vary the form. What is important in here is the content. Um, and then now that we already have a definition and we already know its peculiarities, we can think about, drawing a short history of crime fiction. And when I was preparing the class and, preparing the slides, I realized that I was maybe a bit overambitious in wanting to present the entire history of crime fiction. It's pretty big. And so, but I already had, by the end of the class, when I finished everything, I already had the slides ready. So I decided to just add the short. So this is a short intro, a history of crime fiction. And now I'm actually thinking that I should even have said very short, because we only have 1 hour or so. And there's quite a lot of things to be said. As anything in literature, when we start to talk about history, people often wonder when things started. We suddenly want to find the inventors of it all. Who created? So who is the father of science fiction? Who usually are fathers. It's a very annoying thing, but usually it's always guys, right? I think the way that the history is traditionally told, right? One of the things that have been done in recent decades is precisely challenge that assumption that was practiced for a long time. And this whole idea of finding who is the father of this or the creator of that is a bit, it goes against what we really need in here. It doesn't really add much, and sometimes it creates confusion. To give you one example, we could argue that detective fiction starts, if you want, in the Thousand and One Nights. Okay, in there, this is the famous As Mil e Uma Noites, right, in Portuguese. Sometimes they translate it in English as the Arabian Nights. Okay, so you have in this book here, you have the two titles. Um, in there are three stories that are told by Scheherazade, in which you have a crime. There is, in those cases, murder. And so there is this homicide, there is a crime scene, and they call a guy to investigate, and he sees and he talks to witnesses. So there is something that is very, very similar to a detective story, but the Thousand and One Nights is a text that was composed by a number of different authors. It is mostly anonymous. The oldest stories that are part of it date from 700, so the 8th century of our era. And the latest ones, added to the bunch are actually from the 13th century. So this book was written for 500 years. People were adding things, taking things out, editing and stuff. And so those stories, they are there. They maybe are about 1,000 years old. And you could argue that that is the beginning of crime fiction. Okay, it's not what you're going to find in the books about the history of literature, but it is a possibility. Or you can go even further. In the Bible, for example, David, in a certain moment in the Old Testament, David, he interrogates two different people and he's able to contrast their stories. And you could argue that maybe that is a kind of detective fiction. And you can go even further, if you wish, maybe Gilgamesh or whatever. So it's always difficult to pinpoint one inventor of everything. But there are certainly very important checkpoints along the way, right? And one of those checkpoints in the history of crime fiction is happening in Europe, but not in English. Okay, it is happening in German. In 1819, A.T.A. Hoffman, who is famous for writing fantasy, right? He writes a lot of short stories which involve magic, fairy tales, and so on. But he also writes a lot of things. So he practiced many different genres. He really wrote a lot. And he published this book in 1819 called Mademoiselle de Scutari. Okay, so the title is in French, but the book was written in German. And it is definitely it's about the story is taking place in the 18th century, so it's a bit historic. But you also have a crime that must be solved, and in that case, jewelry has been stolen, and they have to know who stole it, and so on. Okay, this is already has a certain pattern that we'll see over and over again in detective fiction, and a major checkpoint in the development of the genre happens, is brought to the fore by this guy here. Okay, Edgar Allan Poe, who I'm sure all of you know. Oops, I've been coloring my screen somehow. um, can you take care of that, Anna? I have no idea if I did this or how I did it. But
I
I
think
can
you
see,
can
can you
try
see yellow
to,
marks in the slides?
yeah, there
Yeah,
is
okay.
a little pencil on your left bottom
Ah,
side.
okay. So yeah,
You can clear all
now
drawings.
it's an eraser. Great. Awesome.
Technology, guys, sometimes it pulls our rug.
Yeah. And so Edgar Allan Poe is famous, obviously, for his horror stories, right? His short stories are amazing. He has written a lot of poetry, like The Raven, for example, that black little birdie who says nevermore, right? So he's very, very important for the history of horror and extremely influential. Okay, but his influence also extends to crime fiction because he has written in the 1840s, okay, in quick succession, three short stories that have many, many of the characteristics of typical detective novels. Okay, so the first of these stories is The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Okay, published in 1841. Maybe this is the most the revolutionary one, because it is told from the perspective of a friend of the detective. So it's not the detective who is telling us the story, something that is very common. Okay. Think about Sherlock Holmes. There are in some short stories, one or two, Sherlock Holmes himself is telling us his stories. But in most, like in the absolute majority of the Sherlock Holmes stories, the stories are told by Watson, right? And so it's another person who was there, who saw everything, who is telling the story. It's not the detective. And we have exactly the same point of view in here. This person doesn't even have a name. So, we don't know anything about the narrator in this story, but we know a lot about the detective. And the detective is applying what Poe called rationalization to deduce, just like Holmes. He has the clues from the crime scene. He hears what people have to say about it. And then he thinks about it, and he's a little bit able to solve the crime just by thinking, almost as if his brain is so powerful that he's not even investigating much. Something that we will find not only in Sherlock Holmes, but also in Poirot, for example, the detective of one of the detectives created by Agatha Christie, right? Poirot is a good example of it. There are many of his crimes that he solves only by thinking. Sometimes he doesn't even go to the crime scene. He's just like thinking about it, and voila, he has this sudden illumination, right? You also have a very interesting um, reveal at the end. There is the twist. The end of this story is quite unexpected. And the same thing applies to the other two: the mystery of Marie Rouget and the purloined letter. Okay, the mystery of Marie Rouget it has also another important element, because it's based on a real crime that actually took place. And so people got a bit confused when they first read these short stories. We have to remember that today we read those stories in books, but at the time they would be first published in newspapers. So you would get a newspaper in your house, or actually you would buy in the streets, I don't know. You would sit down to read the newspapers, and that there would be real stuff. And then suddenly you would find a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, okay? And maybe this short story is The Black Cat, or I don't know, The Mask of the Red Death, something like that, that is very clearly fictional. But if that short story that you just read in the newspaper is The Mystery of Marie Rouget, it would not be so easy to tell if it's fictional or not. Okay. And so this is something that is very interesting about the beginning of detective novels, that often people took it as truth. People could not really very clearly separate fiction from fact. Okay. And Sherlock Holmes is very much a part of that. Am I going too fast, guys? Is that okay? Okay. So moving on. Conan Doyle, I'll have to jump some things in here. For example, Wiki Collins is one writer who's writing in the UK in between the 1840s, when Edgar Allan Poe writes his detective stories, and the arrival of Arthur Conan Doyle. Sorry. Doyle will, before creating Sherlock Holmes, okay, Holmes is created in 1887. Okay. Before creating Holmes, Doyle writes this short story here, okay? J. Habakkuk Jefferson's Statement. And this short story was published in a magazine, and this is the actual first publication. So you can see the Cornhill magazine, okay? January 1884, okay? And this is what you see. Illustrations, a very interesting thing is that in the 19th century, we often associate illustrations with books for kids, right? But this is something that we do. They didn't do this. And sincerely, they were right, because it's so cool when you have images in the book. It's pretty cool. And so this was published in a magazine, and this is a short story about a real event. Something that happened to a boat that was found in 1873, so 11 years before this story. A boat was found simply floating in the ocean without anyone. No, there was no sign of the crew. No one was inside. Nobody was dead. There was no signs of violence whatsoever. And so no one really knew what happened to the crew, if they escaped for some reason, if they abandoned the ship for some reason, if they, whatever happened, you know. And we never knew, and we don't know. We simply found that ship floating in the ocean in perfect condition in 1873. There should be a lot of people inside, and they were not there. Okay. And this is something that remained with the public, this discussion, what happened to the crew? I think the name of the ship was Mary Stuart, but I might be wrong. Okay. What happened to the crew? Obviously, it was aliens. I guess conspiracy theories will tell us, right? I mean, people love such mysteries, and we love to talk about them and to discuss them, and and a lot of momentum, you know, a lot of discourse keeps going because of that. And so he wrote a short story, a fictional short story about one survivor. So one person who was in the boat and who decided to write this short story to tell people what actually happened. So this would be the testimonial that would solve the mystery. The only thing is that this was a fictional thing, but when it was published, it was a tremendous success because people thought that this was finally the truth. At last, they found someone from the crew, and now we know what happened. Um, and there's apparently Poe did this, as I've mentioned, more than once. And Poe often did this, on purpose, because fake news is pretty good for making money, as we all know by now, in the 21st century, right? So people use fake news to make money. They do it today, and they also did it in the past. We have to remember that Edgar Allan Poe was one of the first professional writers. Okay. He tried to write as a profession, and that was something pretty new. Okay. Most writers could not really survive only by writing until more or less the end of the 19th century. And so Poe was one generation too early, and so he would be working as a journalist as well. And in order to, he actually even owned a couple of newspapers, and he was the editor of newspapers and things like that. And so in order to sell newspapers, fake news were pretty good. And so for Poe, this confusion between fact and fiction sometimes was a bit deliberate because if people thought that it was for real, they would probably talk more about it. They would get more interested in the story, and he would sell more newspapers. Okay. Apparently, was not the case with Conan Doyle. He only wrote the fictional short story, and he was super surprised that people took it as truth, or that many people, not everybody, but many people took it, and many newspapers also talked about this. And so in 1886, he takes 6 weeks to write the first Sherlock Holmes story. He decides to continue pursuing this direction of crime fiction. Conan Doyle is a physician, right? So a medical doctor. He's Scottish. He's from Scotland, he studied in Edinburgh, where he had one of his professor that used to teach, in the clinic, would deduce many things, not only about the diseases that they had to treat. Imagine a patient is unconscious. You cannot ask the person what happened. You have to deduce, you have to investigate to discover what is wrong and how to treat it, right? So investigation is a very big and important part of medicine, right? And remembering the skill of this professor while he was studying medicine in Edinburgh, Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes, right? And the very first story is called A Study in Scarlet. It was written in 1886 and it was published in 1887, also in a magazine, okay? And in a very actually a small magazine, Beaton's Christmas Annual. This is a Christmas special. How interesting, right? And you had a bunch of other things there too. It's not only a study in Scarlet, but you also have, if you look at the cover, you also see that there are other things by other writers. So it's a rather different experience from the one we have today. When we walk in a book, you walk into a bookstore and you buy a book that has Sherlock Holmes written in the cover. And this was completely different. You would be buying a magazine in a different place, and there would be a bunch of texts in there that are completely forgotten and probably not even very good. Okay. Anna, would you like to say anything?
No, I was just
No?
like replying to the comments.
Okay. Okay. And this is another interesting thing is that, Christmas time for us in Brazil, I guess it is the season of watching romantic comedies in Sessão da Tarde or something, right?
Yeah.
And in the UK, however, Christmas season is ghost story season. It's the moment of horror. It's and there's a lot of detective fiction too. So it's rather peculiar from a cultural perspective that they would decide to write crime fiction in a Christmas special. Not a lot of Santa Claus around there, but anyway. A study Scarlet is published, and it is immediately a tremendous success. A legend is born. Holmes will actually uh, go into the Guinness Book of Records for being the most reused character in the world. Okay, they counted over 25,000 appearances in theater, TV series, video games, you name it, card games, whatever you name it. There are so many short stories. There are 4 novels about Sherlock Holmes, 56 short stories. So there is a lot. Conan Doyle himself wrote a lot of stories for Sherlock. But then the Sherlock became a legend. It went so much, be so much beyond, really so much. It got so much bigger and bigger. And it was really um he added to the already developing genre of detective fiction. He was very aware of the production of other writers like Edgar Allan Poe, like Wilkie Collins, for example. And he built on that. And Holmes has a few peculiarities, right? He calls himself a consulting detective, right? So he's providing advice. He's not part of the police and he does not work for the state. He's not, I don't know, in the FBI, let's say, working with the feds. He's not part of the legal justice system at all. He's not like James Bond, who is a spy and has, certain rights that normal citizens do not. Sherlock Holmes is just a normal dude that decided to go around investigating stuff. So in a certain sense, this is very strange, because if you are investigating, a detective should have a few juridical prerogatives, but that's not the case of Holmes. Okay. Not only this, but he does not like the police. He does not respect the police. He does work with the police sometimes, but he's mostly making fun of them, and he's mostly showing to them how bad they are. And at the same time, he doesn't make any effort to help the police improve, nor to actually arrest the criminals. This is so interesting about the psychology of Sherlock Holmes. He's an intellectual of some sort. He doesn't care about philosophy. He doesn't care about many things, but he likes puzzles, right? And so he loves to solve the mysteries even if by the end of the case, when he catches the murderer, uh, I think at least in 50% of cases, he leaves people off the hook, right? He lets them go, basically. he doesn't really care about people paying for their crimes. And this is a very weird, once again, if you're part of if you're fighting crime, imagine Batman, or Superman, getting the criminals and then letting them go just because it was like a game. The purpose was not to get them behind bars necessarily, but actually more to catch them, was more like the puzzle solving, you know? Um, Holmes is a rather peculiar character. And he's funny sometimes, rather aggressive on others. He's always making fun of Watson as well. He thinks other people are not so smart. And actually, this is what Watson himself has to say. Anna, this is a description that we find in the first chapters of Studying Scarlet. So basically, Watson is a physician. He came back from Afghanistan. Okay, there he was part of a mission there. A part of the British Army, and he comes back because he was wounded in the leg. He was shot, I believe, and he survived. But
Mhm.
then he had to go back to England for treatment and rest. And this is why he doesn't have a lot of money. So this is why he decides to share a flat with someone, and then someone introduces him to Holmes. And Watson doesn't really have a lot of things to do. He has a salary because he's a war veteran, and the government continues to pay him because he was in the military, so he continues to receive a salary. And then he has nothing to do, and so he follows Holmes around because he finds Holmes so interesting, so strange, so peculiar, rather exuberant. And this is what he has to say about Holmes's intellect. Can you read it, please, Anna?
Sure. Just before, if you find any challenging words, you can check the meanings here in the glossary, okay? We often do this in class just to facilitate reading. Knowledge of literature, nil. Knowledge of philosophy, nil. Knowledge of astronomy, nil. Knowledge of politics, feeble. Knowledge of botany, variable. Well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons generally. Knows nothing of practical gardening. Knowledge of geology, practical but limited. Tells at a glance different soils from each other. After walks, has shown me splashes upon his trousers and told me their color and consistence in what part of London he had received them. Knowledge of chemistry, profound. Knowledge of anatomy, accurate but unsystematic. Knowledge of sensational literature, immense. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century. Plays the violin well. Is an expert single stick player, boxer, and sportsman. Has a good practical knowledge of British law.
Thank you very much, Anna. So there are two things that I find interesting in this description. First, that Holmes is not a real intellectual in the sense that he doesn't really care about art or philosophy or thinking in general. Okay, he likes to solve puzzles, and he's not so much even in understanding the mechanisms behind the law. He has a good practical knowledge, which means, this the way Watson talks about it presupposes that Watson knows more about the judicial system than Holmes himself, right? And Watson is not a lawyer. Watson is a physician. Okay, a physician, um médico. Okay, so it's a different word that they use in English. So there are many areas of knowledge that Holmes ignores, and Watson finds this interesting. Okay, Anna, would you like to say something?
Yes, just we didn't mention much before, but in this part of knowledge of sensational literature, this is something that is quite interesting and kind of justifies the influence of Edgar Allan Poe and the time in which the stories by Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes they were written, right? Which is the Victorian era, Edwardian era, which is completely dominated by Gothic fiction. So this is one of the reasons why he reads this so much. And this is also the kind of mark that we have of Edgar Allan Poe in the stories as well. If you analyze, for instance, one of the stories, The Hound of Baskervilles, the Hounds of Baskerville, you will also see that there are some kind of senses of the supernatural in the story, right? Which often appears in stories by Sherlock Holmes. So this is a very interesting point to note as well.
Thank you, Anna. And so yeah, so that is very interesting. The fact that he knows everything about sensational literature is how Watson is calling here, and what he means is crimes. Basically, he knows everything. The that you find, and then we do have. There are many Brazilian cities. We have those very cheap newspapers that are talking about crime. Usually very violent stuff, and sometimes they even use humorous language. And so this is the kind of thing that Holmes is reading, and he knows all about it. Okay, so it's a rather different way to approach life, I think, at least in Watson's eye. And it's also relevant that Holmes is a man of action. He's an expert single stick player. Single stick is a martial art that was practiced in England in the 19th century. It still exists, but it's not very mainstream. And basically, it's how to fight with a piece of wood. Okay, so you have a baton, you have a stick, and then you beat people with it, basically. But you have different moves and stuff. So it's a martial art, and he's very good with a stick. He's a boxer, and he's also a swordsman, right? So he knows how to fight with different weapons, and he's an expert in all of those areas. So you need it if you're gonna fight crime, even if you're not part of the police. Uh, Not only this, but Holmes has another interesting characteristic to him, that is the life outside the novels, the life outside of the short stories is rather credible. Okay. There are many things about Holmes, like, for example, his address to 121B Baker Street, um, that we are left wondering if it's fact or fiction. Such place does exist. This is a map of London in 1890, and there is a Baker Street, okay? But actually, it was the same street had three different names because it was broken down at about the number 85. It broke and changed name. It was called York Place, and then it changed name again to Upper Baker Street. Okay, so actually, there was no 221B because the real Baker Street is the one in here, and it ended in number 85. So it kind of could exist, but didn't exist. If you were from London and you wanted to check and you wanted to visit maybe Sherlock Holmes' office, you would not find it, okay? It's a little bit like Hogwarts, I guess. You can't simply walk in. And then if you look at the map today in the 2000s, nowadays Baker Street was unified. And actually it ends on 239. And so nowadays there is actually a 221B. And if you go there in your next, let's say you decide to go to London and to walk around as a tourist, and you decide to go there, you'll see this plaque right here. Okay, it's a saying at the exterior part of the building, 221B, Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, and you even have dates. And these commemorative plaques are used for real people. Okay. So there's no indication, Sherlock Holmes, fictional character created by Arthur Conan Doyle. No, if you do not know, if you're bringing along your daughter or your son or your 5-year-old cousin, they might think that this is a real person. Okay. And you'll find close by, not exactly on the spot, but a few numbers after, you find this nice museum, the Sherlock Holmes Museum. And it's not in the precise spot because in the 1930s, the address to 121B was bought by a bank. Okay, so basically the Abbey Bank, which is Santander, has bought an entire building where this number was included. And they received so many letters every day that were addressed to Sherlock Holmes that they hired one person. They had one person working at the bank just to answer those, to receive and to answer those letters. Okay, so it's a rather peculiar. Why would you do this? Why would you even answer those letters? Why people send such letters? Those are very interesting questions. I guess, yeah, I understand why people write to Santa Claus, but why would you write to Sherlock Holmes unless you think that he's real in some way, right? I guess those are adults because it's not really the kind of things that Sherlock, maybe you would be reading it at 7, but not many people would do this, I think. It's more for grown-ups, I would say. But anyway, the bank is gone, and nowadays, so this museum was not to 121B for quite a long time, but nowadays apparently it is. And if you go there, you will walk in and you see this, okay? The living room of a person who has never existed in a non-existing address in a street that did not exist at the time. So it's fascinating. We know that this is a creation. We know that this is fictional, but do you remember the X-Files, Scully and Mulder? I want to believe. I think that's what's going on in here. I want to believe. I know that he's fake, but I wish Holmes existed, and so I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna look at this room holding objects that are totally fake. Okay. And so the whole thing about Sherlock Holmes is that the fiction is not a fiction. Okay. So when we watch a movie, we know that Game of Thrones is fake. We know that there is no Spider-Man. We know all this. But when we watch a movie, we suspend disbelief, right? We make believe, okay? A gente faz de conta, we make believe. We watch the movie and we accept that those lies, those are artistic lies that we're being told, that they're telling us a nice story. And so for 2 hours or a few more, we accept that that fake thing is for real, right? And Sherlock Holmes and many other texts, many other literary works since millennia, many works play around with this idea that the fiction is not fictional. Okay, the Blair Witch Project, for example, A Bruxa de Blair. Okay, it's a good example, and so many others. Okay, and this is happening not because people are stupid or something. This is happening also because of literature itself, because of the way Sherlock Holmes is written. Because if you read that very first issue of the story, okay, so let's say you were alive in 1887 and you bought this magazine and you read this story about this new detective called Sherlock Holmes. Before you even started to read, you would find this table of contents and you would read this: a study in Scarlet, being a reprint from the reminiscences, the memories, okay, as reminiscências, as memórias, the memoirs of John H. Watson, MD, medical doctor, MD, late of the Army Medical Department. Okay, so basically, it is told to you that this is a real thing. Okay, this is a reprint of the memoirs of this person. And memoirs are a kind of autobiography in a certain sense. So if you're writing a memoir, at least you presuppose that you're telling the truth and it should be real. Okay. Another example of how literature is blending this bordering between reality and fiction. Let's say you bought The Hound of the Baskervilles, the book that Anna just talked about. You bought The Hound of the Baskervilles when it was published in 1902. At the cover, you would see a photo of a guy smoking a pipe, and it would not be, too much to guess that this is a photo of the picture of Sherlock Holmes, right? And you could not be more mistaken. But anyway, the book itself is inducing the reader to commit this mistake, okay? And it could be sometimes we choose to believe, but sometimes we are mistaken. I tell you, I watched the Blair Witch Project when I was 10, And I was terrified because A Bruxa de Blair, right? Because for me, that was proof it was a documentary and documentaries are real. And so for me, that was proof that supernatural existed and witches were real. And I was like, how come everybody's not talking about this? I mean, wow, that's the big deal, okay? So it does happen, and not only with 10-year-olds. It's so much so that one guy used this a lot, okay? Fernando Pessoa is all about inventing writers, inventing heteronyms in English, right? Os heterônimos. Um, and the heteronyms are not only a pen name, a pseudonym, okay? They are not only he changed the name and that's it. No, the heteronyms, they have their entire personalities, their interests. They practice their own poetic forms. That their poetry is completely different. And we know the most famous ones, right? Alberto Caeiro, Álvares de Campos, Ricardo Reis, Bernardo Soares, and so on. But actually, Pessoa created dozens and dozens and dozens of heteronyms, sorry. And I find fascinating that our beloved Saramago, right, the only Nobel Prize that Portuguese language has got, um, famously has read Ricardo Reis without knowing that he was fictional, you know? So he read Ricardo Reis, he loved it, he thought he was such a great poet, and only later that he eventually discovered that this was one of the emanations of Fernando Pessoa. So this is exactly the kind of blending that we're finding in Sherlock Holmes that Pessoa is practicing here. And it's fooling someone as just as big and as important and as creative as José Saramago. So I think we're excused to believe in it every now and then. And I find also interesting that when Pessoa grew up in South Africa, this is one of the things that people often forget about his life. Is he's a very interesting person, right? And he lived for most of his life in Lisbon, but he spent many years in South Africa. This is why he also wrote in English. Okay, we also don't talk a lot about this, but Pessoa published two books in English with poems in English and one book with poems in French. So Pessoa wrote in three different languages, and and many of his texts in English were signed with this heteronym here, Alexander Search. And I find this, and this is an actual card that he printed, to give around to people, the welcoming card of Alexander Search. And so there you go, very detective-like of Fernando Pessoa. Okay. Let's talk a little bit how much time we have. Okay, that's great. Is it okay? Am I going too fast? Sorry, guys, I get a bit I'm pretty enthusiastic, I think, as you can see, and so I can go very fast. So yeah, if you have questions, write down in the chat. Anna is there assisting you. If you're understanding 80%, 85% of what I'm saying, that's pretty good. Okay, that's pretty good. And there are sometimes in Zoom, there is a setup where you can see the subtitles. So you could also activate this if you're having difficulties. I'll try my best not to, go too fast. Let's talk a little bit about general characteristics of crime fiction. Okay, so I've mentioned before that it's defined by the plot, basically, but what is happening in the story. If you open the book and it's a love story, it's by definition not crime fiction. If it's boy meets girl, they fall in love, they cannot be together, but eventually happy ending. This is a different kind of content. This is a different kind of genre, right? In order to have some sort of not only crime fiction, but actually detective fiction, so a subgenre, okay? You need a crime, or at least a mystery, okay? So something happened, and this something needs explanation. And then there are two opposing ways authors can approach the mystery. One of them is this one in here, who done it? Okay, and then we write it all together like this, but who has done it? Who done it? Okay, this is the actual term that we use in literary theory. And the whodunit type of story, it's precisely about discovering who did it, right? So you want to know who is the murderer. You want to know who stole the painting, etc. Okay. Um, the opposite of the whodunit is the next one. How catch him? Okay. How to catch them? Okay. How catch him? Because usually in this kind of story, you already know in the beginning who committed the crime. Okay, who did that? Sometimes, or at least you have a very good indication. You already know how the crime was committed. But now the whole point of the story is seeing how the police and the detectives are gonna get the criminal, how they're gonna work with the clues, how they're gonna eventually get to him or to them at the end. So one is about finding the solution to the crime, and the other one is about already having the solution, but then getting the person into justice. Okay. So in a certain way, they are one the opposite of the other, because in most of the how catch them, in most of these kind of stories, you already know who the person is, or at least you have a very strong indication. So the stories are built in slightly different ways. You always have, and there are many possibilities in between. Okay, guys, there's not, those are the two extremes, I would say. And then you have many possibilities here and there and different nuances, right? Then the creativity of the author will show itself in combining all the possible characteristics. Um, you also need a detective, clearly, someone who is collecting those clues, who is finding the patterns, and who is having suspicions, so he's creating hypotheses and testing them, and we are following it usually with a privileged perspective because we're following it, as a best friend, or as, I don't know, as some kind of colleague. But usually it's not the detective himself or herself who is telling us the story. Okay. The person who is telling the story is usually the sidekick. So the last image in here, Watson is Holmes's sidekick. Okay. Sidekick is this term for the lesser hero. So both of them are important. Both of them are heroes. But Watson is a little bit less. He's always a bit less. He's less intelligent. He's less active. He's always lost, and it has to be this way because Watson is always a bit lost, and precisely because Watson is lost, that Holmes shines so much. So the sidekick is a bit limited, precisely to give the protagonist a lot of space to give us surprises, to give us to create the suspense and everything. And the sidekick brings to the story. Usually the detective is a bit peculiar. Holmes is filled with peculiarities, and Watson is a rather traditional guy, and so they complement each other very well. And this is something that usually happens. Sidekicks usually complement the hero they are helping. This is not only something that only exists in detective stories. Okay, you can think of Don Quixote, for example. Okay, Don Quixote. He has a sidekick, Sancho Panza, right? And they are really complementary. Even in physically, Quixote is very tall and very thin. Panza is small and fat, and so even physically, they are a little bit the opposite of one another. And you can go beyond. You can think about Shrek. Okay, as sidekicks, think about Toy Story. Okay, Buzz Lightyear and so on. I mean, you usually have this dynamics of one main hero and then his helper, and the helper is the sidekick. So the two of them are trying to interpret the clues, and eventually they're gonna get we're following the story from the eyes of the sidekick, and this is important because if we were inside the detective's head, we would know, there would be no surprise, because the discovery would grow little by little. There would be not a sudden revelation of who the murderer is. Holmes often knows who the person is almost since almost the beginning of the story, but then he wants to find the proofs and everything, and then in the end he reveals it. And usually, uh, he never tells Watson before, so Watson is always surprised. And this is why we're following the story from the sidekick's perspective, because he has less information and therefore there's more surprise, right? It's cooler this way, basically. And the detective has a lot of suspects, but we are readers, we as readers, sorry, we are also trying to solve the crime, right? But we don't have enough all the information that the detective has. And often the author will plant fake suspects to us, and the terminology for those are red herrings. Okay, a herring is a kind of fish, arenque in Portuguese. I don't understand a lot about fish, but I believe this is the name in Portuguese. And so, imagine a red fish, okay? That would call a lot of attention. And so this is why it's called a red herring, because there's always a very obvious suspect. And so this is the person, that is this person will not be the murderer. You always know that it will not be, because it would be so obvious. The book would be so disappointing if the main suspect was actually the guy, right, who did it. And so the red herring is there as a fake clue to make you look in the wrong direction, and then you get the surprise in the end. Okay, so we often welcome the red herring, actually. And also one thing that happens often is when the crime is finally revealed, right? There is some kind of action in some point of the story. So the criminal will try to escape, or he's gonna kidnap someone, or he's gonna fight Holmes, or he's gonna do something. And so there will be some kind of action, fighting, persecution, uh, driving cars very fast, whatever you wanted, explosions. And so you often have this element of action within the story, right? And so detective fiction is in one sense a very fixed genre, because it has a certain pattern that has to follow. But in another sense, it is capable of encompassing, okay? Abraçar, to encompass, englobar, okay? So it's capable of encompassing different genres and different possibilities. For example, like action, okay? And so this is Watson, okay? And you can look by his mustache. This was how people would be dressing, very proper, very traditional, very Victorian. He, once again, is a doctor, and he's portrayed as the traditional gentleman, the traditional Victorian era man, and precisely the opposite of Holmes. Holmes is not married. Holmes doesn't really have, his job goes in and off. Uh, he doesn't really care about what society thinks of him. So he's a very different person, living a very different lifestyle. And so Watson, being the very traditional guy, once again emphasizes the contrast between the two. Okay. And now that we have talked about all the elements of crime fiction, we can try to see how it has influenced other genres as well. Okay, I've mentioned in the beginning of the class that for surprising reasons, science fiction and fantasy and horror are rather similar in some ways to crime. And we can find this in fantasy. So I'll take one example from one of our courses. Okay, this class is similar to what we do in the short stories course, but another course that we have is called actually we have three different courses that are called novels, and in which we read books, right? So we read a book a month, like you would expect, considering the name of the school. And the novels intermediate is in this course, we read books that are in the original, right? They are unadapted. They are, you have the full content there. They are unabridged, but they are a bit easier, shorter sentences, easier vocabulary, and so it's a good entry point. So we think of this course as a course that people who have an intermediate level of English could follow. And in this, these are the books we'll be reading, and three of them, oops, sorry, are fantasy, right? Mowgli, you all know him, the wolf child, right, from India who talks to Baloo and so on. We could call it fantasy. It looks like a fairy tale a little bit, but we have a, we have a wolf child. He speaks to animals. There are in one of the stories he finds a magical object and stuff. So we could call it fantasy. It's one of the great classics of the Victorian period. It was published just a few years after Sherlock Holmes. Another example that we have in here is Howl's Moving Castle, right? The one that this was made into a movie by the Ghibli studio, the anime from Japan. Castelo Encantado, I believe, is it's the title in Portuguese, and
Castelo
it's a
Animado.
Castelo Animado.
Mhm.
Yeah. And in just like in Mowgli, you have a certain investigation because Mowgli wants to discover who he is, right? And who are his human parents and so on. In Howl's Moving Castle, you have a similar investigation because she's cursed by a witch and she has to discover how to break the curse. And also she looks for the help of this wizard called Howl. But this wizard is very peculiar and strange. And so to discover the personality, the psychology of this wizard is also part of the mystery, right? And so you have in those fantasy, in those fantasy narratives, many elements that are similar to detective stories, although not they are not detective stories themselves. Okay, and I think even more so with Harry Potter that I really don't have to introduce. Right, this is the original title is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and here is called the Sorcerer's Stone because this is the title of the edition in the USA. But if we talk about this book, okay, the first book in the series, um, there are many, many things that we can think to put side by side Sherlock Holmes and Harry Potter. And in the surface, they don't have anything in common, you know? But we could first point to the fact that they're both two very real world phenomena, right? The Potter series has sold over 600 million copies. Okay. It's pretty bizarre. It's like huge, absolutely huge. And in the same way that Sherlock Holmes is an enormous industry, and really, it's difficult to find someone who doesn't know who Sherlock Holmes is. Pretty tough. I would say the same thing applies to Harry Potter. If you think about the series, each one of the books, be it sorry, be it in the Chamber of Secrets, be it the Prisoner of Azkaban, whatever you want, you always have, or nearly always, you have a certain mystery at the core of every Harry Potter book that has to be solved, that has to be investigated by, usually by Harry and his sidekicks, right? He has sidekicks. He has one very clear sidekick, who is Ron, right? Ron Weasley. Ron is much slower than Harry is not the brightest, right? Hermione is. So she's the very smart one. She's the one that catches things in the air. But Harry, his intelligence is not really appearing in class. If you discount defense against the dark arts, right, where he's pretty good, but in everything else he's pretty bad, or at least average. But for certain elements about discovering the mystery, it's usually Harry who solves the mysteries. It's him who discovers and who solves everything, usually with the help of Ron and Hermione, but they are working as sidekicks. Okay, so it's not the traditional, it's not exactly the same thing as Holmes and Watson, but it's pretty close, right? And just like Holmes, Potter has his exceptional protagonist in the sense that he has skills that are necessary to solve the mystery, right? He can fly very well, and he often needs to fly to be able to do things. Okay, you can think about, I don't know, the Goblet of Fire, for example, the fourth book in which he has to fly to solve some of the part of the mystery. and fight dragons and things like that. He's capable. Holmes is very good in disguising himself. And so is Harry. Harry has an invisibility cloak, right? And so he's able to watch on people and stuff like that. And he's pretty lucky. And this is also part of detective fiction. I find it, I just recently read the entire Harry Potter series once again. Since we're going to teach it, I decided to reread all the series. And I find it very amazing and funny how Harry's always at the right place at the right time. He's just so lucky. He overhears all the important conversations. It's just so unlikely. And man, he has very good ears. I would lose at least half of what they're saying, but Harry and he listens to 100% and understand all the words. And so this is part of the fictional pact that we accept when we start reading, right? And so this is very similar to what happens in many of the Sherlock Holmes stories, right? And Harry, with his skills, also speaking, he's a parcel tongue, right? He can speak the language of snakes, for example. Is one of the skills that he has that nobody else has, exceptionally, with the exception of Voldemort. And this skill is necessary to solve many of the mysteries as well. So he shows that he's exceptional, just like Holmes. And in every book, we're given suspects and red herrings. And in every book, I would say this main suspect is always the same, Snape, bloody Snape, every time. And every time we're wrong. So every time we think this time it's really Snape, and then we're up for a surprise, right? So not only this, but just like Holmes as well, he has an archie enemy. Okay, Holmes has Professor Moriarty. Okay, who is a genius, and Harry has Lord Voldemort, right? So the Dark Lord, they call him. So you see, one is a professor, the other is a lord. So you see, there is this title, there is this pomposity to it. If you think about Voldemort's name, his actual name is Tom Riddle. Riddle, charada. Okay, riddle is another word for mystery, actually. So you can see many of these elements. Another one, I think I'm going to even go faster because I think we already have enough. But Hogwarts is often an enclosed space. When something happens there, you know that the person that they're looking for is inside the castle, right? And this is exactly how I don't know, the Murders in the Orient Express works. Okay, in that book, the train stops. Nobody can leave the train, nobody can come into the train, and so they know that the murderer is one of them, right? And so this idea that one place is isolated, it's something that we see a lot in detective fiction, and so in the Harry Potter as well. We also see incompetent police, but in the case of Harry, is the Ministry of Magic, who is pretty bad all the time. Fudge is the worst, and they're pretty incompetent, just like the police is in Holmes. And if you still had any doubt, the author of Harry Potter has written another series of books about a detective called Corcoran Strike, and it's detective fiction, pure detective fiction. So you can see clearly how, interestingly enough, we would never expect for a fantasy bestseller like Harry Potter to be influenced by detective fiction and Sherlock Holmes of all people, but it is. It is. Um, let's talk a little bit, coming back to the short history of the genre. Let's talk a little bit about Holmes' influence. Right, we have another 15 minutes to go. Um, or just reshare my slides because they're not moving.
Guys, if you have any questions, you can start writing them on chat, and after the session, we'll answer them, okay?
Yeah, we'll end at 8:30, 8:35 probably. Okay. To talk about the legacy of Conan Doyle, I'll just before we do that, I'll talk a little bit about our other courses. As I said, this course is the kind of thing that we would do in the short stories course that is taught by Anna. In our usual classes, we speak much less, and the students have a lot ample space to ask questions and debate and during the class, which is something that we can't really do in an open class like this one. It's rather different. We'll be reading those authors. I've talked about some of them already. Margaret, some of them are read in translation, like Hong Kong and Yourcenar. Yourcenar is Belgium, and she writes in French, one of the great writers of the 20th century. Joseph Conrad is Polish, but he writes in English, famous for The Heart of Darkness. We'll read one of his short stories. And I guess not many of you might know Ted Chiang. He's a contemporary writer, still quite young. He writes science fiction. In my opinion, an absolutely brilliant writer. We're going to hear a lot from him in the future. He has written only 2 books. Both of them are absolutely genius. And he's the guy, for example, who wrote, do you know that movie about the aliens and the linguist that has to learn their language? Arrival, maybe the title?
Arrival.
So
A Chegada.
yeah. So it's based on one of his short stories, for example. Science fiction is very, very intelligent. I warmly recommend it to you. Another course, this one is taught by me, is called Reading Class. And the idea of the short story is that if you have up to an hour of time every week to read, this is a good course for you. But if you don't have time at all, you could try the reading class. In this course, what we're doing is we're reading short stories or sometimes poetry as well, but much short stories, much more. We're reading them in class all together. I'm paraphrasing the text. I'm explaining difficult words, difficult expressions, correcting some mistakes and things like that. These are the amazing people who read. Too many to present them now, but Tolstoy, for sure, you know. Coleridge is one of the most important romantic poets of England. Shirley Jackson is one of the great writers of horror fiction of the USA, has amazing short stories. Catherine Mansfield is from New Zealand, one of the most important modernist writers. Virginia Woolf, none other than Virginia Woolf, has said that Catherine Mansfield is the, quote, is the only writer who I envy, end quote. Okay, so if Virginia Woolf says this about you, you're pretty good. James Joyce, probably one of the greatest writers to have ever lived, in my opinion. Absolutely genius. Selma Lagerlöf, she's Norwegian. We'll be reading her in translation. She won the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And so many others. I can talk about all of them. Another course, one of our courses is in which we read a book a month is also the Novels Advanced, in which we'll be talking about speculative fiction. Okay, so speculative fiction are those stories that ask us, what if? They create a hypothesis. For example, what if we were all blind? Okay, and then you have Ensaio sobre a Cegueira. Okay, it's a hypothesis, and then then you have the narrative, and that's a speculation that is built upon that hypothesis. So those are the kinds of narratives we'll be reading in this course. We'll start with Frankenstein, one of the great classics of the history of literature. We'll move to a philosophic study by Milan Kundera, okay, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, a sentence that is taken from Nietzsche, right? So it's a very philosophical novel about political oppression, very beautiful. Then we'll move on to Nutshell by Ian McEwan, who is a contemporary writer. And this is a detective fiction of sorts. This is the history of the story of Hamlet, but it's told from the baby who is still inside of a pregnant woman. So he's a fetus, actually. He's an unborn, and he's telling us the story of how his father was murdered. And so it's a very interesting, it's a reversal of Hamlet, because Hamlet has to revenge his father, right? And so we see the story of Hamlet from the perspective of the baby, okay? So it's Brás Cubas ao contrário, basically, okay? Not someone who died, but someone who was not yet born. Brilliant, and it's a very funny novel about detective fiction as well. We'll also read 20 Leagues Under the Sea, one of the great classics of science fiction that is also working as a kind of detective fiction as well, because who is Captain Nemo? How did he build the Nautilus and so on? So it's a very interesting novel. And then we'll end up with a dystopia, right? A Clockwork Orange, Laranja Mecânica, famous because of the brilliant movie. But also, this is a very interesting novel because he's inventing a new language with many slangs and words from the Russian and stuff. So it's a very, very interesting to read, especially to read in the original, because in the translation, those things they will change. They have to change because he's inventing a kind of English for just this book. So, um, Anna, would you like to say anything about the novel's intermediate course?
Yeah, I mean, like you have already introduced some of them, and this is a selection that we really enjoy. But I think we haven't mentioned much further The Bad Beginning, one of the novels of a series of unfortunate events, Desventuras em Série, which is a classic, right? And it's a very interesting short novel, people, because it might be one of the first contacts that you have with kind of experimental literature to the point that an intermediate level speaker can really read and understand well, right? So it's a really good introduction to literary text. And also, we cannot forget to talk about Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Lucy Maud Montgomery, she's Canadian. She was Canadian, and she has created this absolute beautiful saga of Anne of Green Gables. It's a very touching coming of age story, right? It's a story that follows this character for a long, long time in her life, and this is the first one. And if you don't recognize the name of the book, probably you'll remember the TV series Anne with an E on Netflix, which is beautiful, absolutely beautiful, and it's focused on the story by Montgomery. Um, and I teach novels intermediate, short stories, but also I teach novels big reads, which is continuing its legacy by reading some of the other stories by Jane Austen that we have started reading this year. For those who don't know it yet, this is the year that we celebrate 250 years of Jane Austen's birth, and we are celebrating it with her, right? And in the beginning of the year, we read three novels by Jane Austen: Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and also Persuasion. And now we're going to continue reading her most famous novels, Northanger Abbey, Emma, and Mansfield Park. And the difference between novels big reads from the other novels is that we take longer with the books because the books are longer as well, right? So we stay 2 months with each of them, and we have more classes because they need it, right? And just so you know, like one of you, I think is Gabriela, she was asking if you need to know anything about literature in order to join our course, right? Actually, you don't need to know anything, people. We teach everything that you need. Yes. And so it includes this kind of class that we have here that Audio is brilliantly presenting today, which also includes the historical and artistical background of the novel, right? So this is you will have everything that you need from us in class, right? So you don't need to worry. Next one. And also, for the ones who don't feel that they are really sure about the level of English, or that they are, but they want to complement and add up a little bit more to their English studying time, we also offer English classes in group that happen mostly in English in the levels of intermediate, but also advanced. And we have these times that you see here in the screen, right? And you can alternate between those. It's the same group, same class, it's just a different time. This happens with all of our courses. We always have two groups, so you can alternate between the times if you want. And this course is taught by teacher Gabi Nauri, who is also here. Gabi, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Hello, good evening, everyone. So I'm teacher Gabi. I teach the English courses. As you may notice, we have four groups, right? Two intermediate and two advanced. And it's a pleasure for me to be part of this project because I'm a huge fan of Anna and Aurel, and also of literature because I'm a bit of a bookworm, as you may notice. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. And if you have any questions, please ask me.
Oh, thank you so much, Gabi. And people, just so you know, Gabi a little bit more, right? She has an undergraduate course in letras, right? She's a licensed teacher. She also is licensed by the University of Cambridge, right? So she's a certificate teacher, right? And she also has ample experience living abroad. She lived in Dublin, also in Italy, right, Gabi? She speaks other languages as well besides English. And also, she has been reading with us for a long, long time, right? In a book a month. So, besides the great, amazing teacher that she is, she also loves literature and studies literature with all of us. Yes. So, thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, we're honored to have Gabi as part of the team. So that's it, guys. Enough of marketing. Okay, those are the prices. You can pay monthly if you decide to join, or if you pay the whole semester, you have a discount. People that want to do more than one course, there's a big discount as well. Sometimes you can combine literature and English, and it's definitely a very good way to create a full immersion. And this is something that we do personally. We practice what we preach. You can see our books in here, and if I don't know if you can read the titles, but you'll see that there are many books there. Most books actually are in foreign languages, and so we actually do this all the time in our own studies. Both Anna and myself are studying German at the moment, and we also do exactly this. So we know that this thing works. It's interesting, it's motivating, and it works very well. Those are the schedules. If you want to have a look at it, you find it in our website, in the Instagram. So it's pretty much everywhere, or just talk to us. We can send it to you. Okay. Enough of marketing. Let's talk about the good stuff. Okay, back to the history of crime fiction. We're almost done. So the first story by Sherlock Holmes is published in 1887, A Study in Scarlet. And then 3 years later, we get The Sign of the Four, right? Which is also published in a magazine and now in the Limp Scott. This is very cool because when this story was bought, it was in a meeting, and there were three people in this meeting. The editor of the Lipin Scott magazine, Arthur Conan Doyle, and none other than Oscar Wilde. Okay, and so the editor called them and asked for new stories from scratch. And so Conan Doyle wrote The Sign of the Four, and Oscar Wilde wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray. So it's pretty cool because in this magazine, from a few months later, Conan Doyle finished before, and so his book was published before. And then just a few months later, it was published. The Picture of Dorian Gray was published. Okay, another great classic from the period. And actually, Conan Doyle knew and had read already Oscar Wilde. He appreciated Oscar Wilde very much, and he was so surprised and so honored because Oscar Wilde already knew about him and had read already his books. And so Conan Doyle felt like the luckiest person ever in this meeting. Anyway, so he writes another novel in 1890, and then two collections of short stories in 1892 and 1894. Each one of those books, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, they both contain 12 stories each. So you have 24 short stories in total. And the thing is, Conan Doyle was not a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, surprisingly. Okay, he thought that these books were worse than his real literature. Okay, so he wrote another 26 books that are not related to Sherlock Holmes. And he thought that those books were the real thing, and Sherlock Holmes was just this hobby that he had. And so he didn't really want it to continue. He didn't appreciate so much the success. Strange, but that is how it was it. And so he killed Sherlock Holmes in the last story of the fourth book, okay, of the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. In the last story, he dies, okay? He hugs Moriarty and they jump from a waterfall in Switzerland. And so he falls to his death. But we never see the body, right? But he disappears. And so that's it. The public got insane. Everybody was so mad. His editor was so mad because by this time Sherlock Holmes was an industry. It was a gold mine. You could get so much money. But Doyle, I kind of respect this. You know, he was seated upon a pile of gold and he said, "Yeah, I don't care. I'm going to write other stuff." But eventually you have to pay your bills. Os boletins, ninguém escapa dos boletos. And so in 1902, he came back, he resurrected, Sherlock Holmes reappears with this novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles. And this is a very interesting one, as Anna mentioned before, because his flirt initially, it seems that it's not a person who is committing the crimes, it is a kind of a ghost. And, for at least half of the book, you think this is a ghost story. And so this is a very strange, it's even, I would argue it's even a new thing because it's a combination of a ghost story with detective fiction. So it's rather new in this sense. Then he will go on from 1902 until 1927, so basically 3 years before his death. He will write yet another novel by about Sherlock Holmes and another 32 stories. So we have 4 novels and 56 short stories in total. It's an enormous canon of stories by Conan Doyle. And he will, as I've mentioned, write another 26 books and 150 short stories and articles, other texts. Okay, so he wrote really a lot. And it's very interesting that most of these have been completely forgotten, and things about, science fiction, poetry, theater, a lot of things. And actually, one of those unrelated books, probably you know it, because it's a certain book about dinosaurs called The Lost World. Okay? If you grew up in the 90s, I'm pretty sure you understand which movie I'm talking about, right? So The Lost World, that's it. But that's things for another day. But yeah, even in there, Conan Doyle is also related to Jurassic Park in some crazy way. That's it. We'll have another another open class in a week, guys. If you want to join, we'll be talking about Mary Shelley and Jane Austen and how they innovate the Gothic, the horror as a genre. Okay, it will be next Saturday, so the 2nd of August during the afternoon. Okay, and we'll be sharing all the material from tomorrow morning on the Instagram. And that's it. Thank you so much for participating, okay, and being here with us. If you have comments or questions, we're all ears, okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, audio. People, if you have questions, you can either just open your mic and speak, or if you wanna use the chat, right? But one of them I have already answered, and the other one, Camila was asking if you can purchase the recordings of previous courses, right? For example, the ones that we had in the last semester and the previous ones, you can, right? All classes are recorded. So if you are interested in one of our past readings, you can just contact us through WhatsApp. This is the link, right? And we have a catalog. We can send you the catalog and you can choose the ones that you want to see. Yes. Any questions? Anything that you would like to say? No?
Someone was
Okay.
asking what was the title of the 2 books that I've mentioned that
Yeah.
Pessoa wrote in English. So I placed them in the chat there, okay?
I had already answered.
Okay.
Yeah, I sent also a link to one post online talking about that. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, everybody. All right, so if you don't have any questions, you can also, maybe they will pop up later and you can send us a message on WhatsApp. And when you're talking to us, you're always talking to me, actually. I'm always the person answering you. So if you have questions about the classes, about the teaching, about your level of English, talk to me directly, right? I'll be happy to help you. And yeah, I hope to see you all in our next open class, which is going to be taught by me, right, on the 2nd of August.
Thank you so much for your time, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye-bye. Take
people.
care.
Thank you. Bye bye. Have a great time. Thank you. Thank you, Carolzinha. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so I'll end the session. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. See you in the next one.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Thank you, everybody on YouTube. Thank you, Carol, Thalita, Luciana, Bia, my mother. Everybody, thank you so much. Leila, thank you. Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye, everybody.